Inside the United States federal prison system exists a world most Americans will never see, a world shaped not by wardens or correctional officers, but by the inmates who have learned to survive its unforgiving brutality. It is a world governed by violence, hierarchy, and fear, an underground society where races divide into factions, alliances are as fragile as a razor blade, and every decision can be a matter of life or death. This hidden realm has developed its own power structures, its own codes, and its own ruthless systems of justice. To the men who inhabit it, prison is not simply a place of confinement. It is a battlefield, a territory contested by criminal organizations, whose influence extends far beyond the iron bars and concrete walls. Among these organizations, none has cast a darker or more violent shadow than the Aryan Brotherhood. The Aryan Brotherhood, known inside the prisons as the Brand, is more than a gang. It is a command structure, a paramilitary organization built on white supremacist ideology and decades of accumulated power. For generations, it has acted as both a shield for white inmates who feel vulnerable and a weapon that enforces dominance through calculated terror. From its earliest days, the Brotherhood set itself apart through discipline, organization, and a willingness to kill without hesitation. In a system where respect is measured in blood, they learned early that violence was the strongest currency. By the late 20th century, the Aryan Brotherhood's influence reached into federal penitentiaries across the nation. These prisons became segregated battlegrounds in which each racial group fought for space, protection, and control of contraband economies. But while many prison gangs thrived on chaos, the Brotherhood relied on structure. Orders were passed like military directives. Alliances were judged not on emotion, but on utility. Loyalty was absolute, and revenge, swift, brutal, and often fatal, was considered a necessary tool of governance. Within this environment, the Brotherhood evolved into a shadow state. Its leaders, men like Barry the Baron Mills and Tyler the Hulk Bingham, operated from inside tiny segregation cells, yet their influence rippled out to entire federal facilities. They issued commands for murders, extortion rackets, and drug distribution networks that funneled millions in narcotics through prison yards and into nearby communities. These were not spur-of-the-moment acts of violence, but well-planned missions designed to maintain dominance and uphold the gang's racial ideology. It was inside this world of coded messages, sharpened steel, and ironclad loyalty that a lesser-known yet deeply embedded member named Christopher Overton Gibson built his reputation. Gibson was not a household name like some of the Brotherhood's legendary figures. He wasn't a charismatic leader or a feared assassin whispered about across the yards. Instead, he was something arguably more important, a dependable operator. Federal prosecutors later described him as a member responsible for the gang's day-to-day activities, a man trusted to enforce discipline, manage communications, and assist in carrying out the operations that kept the Brotherhood alive. This would prove to be both his power and his downfall. For in the early 2000s, the Aryan Brotherhood faced what would become one of the largest federal crackdowns in U.S. prison history. The government launched a sweeping RICO investigation aimed not merely at prosecuting individual crimes, but at dismantling the gang's entire leadership network. They dug into murders, conspiracies, extortion schemes, and racial policies designed to incite violence. And within the vast web of evidence gathered, agents discovered chilling details. Brotherhood leaders had ordered the murder of multiple black inmates as part of a campaign to maintain racial supremacy. Christopher Overton Gibson was tied directly to that conspiracy. What followed would place him at the center of a historic trial that exposed the inner workings of the Aryan Brotherhood like never before. It revealed a criminal empire built behind prison walls, and the men willing to kill to keep it alive. To understand the case against Christopher Overton Gibson, one must first understand the organization that shaped him, empowered him, and ultimately pulled him into the center of one of the most significant federal gang prosecutions in American history. The Aryan Brotherhood was not born fully formed, nor did it rise to power overnight. Its evolution was gradual, forged through decades of conflict, alliances, betrayals, and relentless bloodshed. But at its core, the Brotherhood remained rooted in a simple, uncompromising principle: racial domination achieved through violence. The gang emerged in the mid-1960s at California's infamous San Quentin State Prison. At that time, California's prison yards were undergoing a transformation as new racial groups and alliances clashed against each other for space and survival. Black inmates had formed the Black Guerrilla family. Chicano inmates rallied behind emerging groups with cultural and political identities, and white inmates, increasingly outnumbered, felt vulnerable. Out of this atmosphere, the Aryan Brotherhood was born, not as a social club or a political movement, but as a survival mechanism for white inmates who believed they needed protection in an increasingly polarized prison world. Yet protection came with a price. From its inception, the Brotherhood embraced a code of violence that surpassed anything comparable on the yards. Members were required to prove themselves through acts of brutality, often expected to stab, assault, or murder on command. This blood initiation later gave rise to the gang's famous oath: blood in, blood out. Those who joined did so through violence. Those who left did so only in death. This uncompromising rule set the tone for everything the Brotherhood would become. By the 1970s and 1980s, the Aryan Brotherhood expanded far beyond its origins. It infiltrated federal penitentiaries, absorbing new recruits and linking with outside criminal enterprises. But what made the Brotherhood especially dangerous was not just its numbers. It was its organization. The gang developed a leadership structure with generals, lieutenants, and soldiers. Commands flowed from the top down, often sent through coded letters known as kites or delivered by trusted intermediaries. The Brotherhood became a military-style institution, and its leaders treated violence as an administrative tool. The gang's ideological backbone, white supremacy, was more than symbolism. It was weaponized. The Brotherhood saw racial conflict not as random yard disputes, but as components of a larger strategy to maintain control. Black inmates were viewed as enemies. Hispanic gangs were seen as rivals or temporary allies, and any white inmate who refused to align with the Brotherhood risked being labeled a target. In many prisons, a white man could not walk the yard without tacit approval from the Brotherhood's shot callers. This ideology, enforced through fear, allowed the gang to build sophisticated criminal enterprises. They ran extortion rackets, taxing inmates who wanted protection or access to contraband. They controlled drug pipelines inside the prisons, often in partnership with outside suppliers connected through biker gangs or local drug networks. The Brotherhood's reach extended so far that federal investigators eventually discovered connections to homicides ordered in the free world, murders planned inside a prison cell but carried out in streets hundreds of miles away. Violence was the gang's currency. It was how debts were collected, how disputes were resolved, and how loyalty was tested. One failed hit or one act of disobedience could result in execution by one's own brothers. This culture forced members into absolute obedience, knowing that hesitation or betrayal could mean a death sentence. Leaders like Barry Mills and Tyler Bingham, already serving life sentences, used this obedience to wage multi-state murder campaigns, issuing orders from isolation units where they spent 23 hours a day locked in concrete cells. Christopher Overton Gibson entered this world during one of the Brotherhood's most violent eras. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, the gang was under immense pressure. Federal authorities had begun targeting prison gangs with new intensity, using advanced surveillance techniques and flipping former members who sought to escape the deadly cycle of loyalty. The Brotherhood responded to these pressures the only way it knew, with brutality. They tightened internal discipline, enforced harsher loyalty tests, and escalated racial tensions across multiple facilities. Within this powder keg environment, Gibson's involvement deepened. He was no longer just another white inmate seeking protection. He was a recognized operative who executed orders, handled day-to-day responsibilities, and helped maintain the gang's operational continuity. To those outside, he was a minor figure. To the Brotherhood, he was an asset. And to federal prosecutors, he was one more vital piece in a murderous machine that had to be dismantled. As the Aryan Brotherhood prepared to unleash new waves of violence, Gibson's name began appearing more frequently in intercepted communications and informant reports. His role in the gang's infrastructure would soon place him at the center of a conspiracy that exposed the Brotherhood's darkest and most racially driven intentions. A conspiracy to murder black inmates as part of a deliberate campaign of terror. Christopher Overton Gibson did not enter the federal prison system as a legend, a leader, or even a known threat. Like countless other inmates who found themselves behind the razor wire, his early years in custody were shaped by instinctive survival, learning the rules of the yard, recognizing who held power, and understanding how quickly violence could erupt over the smallest perceived slight. But what separated Gibson from many others was his ability to adapt to the Brotherhood's culture of discipline and his willingness to prove his loyalty through actions rather than words. In a world where talk meant nothing and violence meant everything, this willingness became his pathway to influence. Gibson's early involvement with the Aryan Brotherhood followed a familiar path: observation, association, then absorption into the gang's orbit. White inmates seeking protection often gravitated toward the Brotherhood, but protection alone was seldom enough to gain full acceptance. What leaders sought were men who could be counted on, men who would carry messages, enforce rules, and act without hesitation. Gibson demonstrated these qualities early. He earned a reputation as someone who listened more than he spoke, someone who understood the need for secrecy, and someone who did not shrink from the gang's violent expectations. By the late 1990s, Gibson had begun moving deeper into the Brotherhood's internal structure. He was not a general, nor did he aspire to be one. Instead, he embraced the role of a mid-level operator, the kind of member who kept the engine running. Federal court documents and later testimony described him as responsible for day-to-day activities, a phrase that in the Brotherhood's world carried immense weight. Day-to-day activities meant circulating orders, managing communication chains, ensuring lower-level members followed protocol, and maintaining discipline through intimidation or violence. It meant being the connective tissue between leadership and soldiers. Inside prison, these roles were not theoretical. They were lived out in constant, palpable tension. Every day, Gibson navigated a world of shifting alliances, coded messages, and unspoken threats. A stray comment or a misunderstood order could spark racial war on the yard. A rumor of betrayal could lead to a killing in a shower stall or a stabbing on the rec yard. Through all this, Gibson maintained the trust of Brotherhood shot callers, a trust that was neither easily earned nor freely given. His rise was aided by his reliability. While some members sought prestige through dramatic acts of violence or attempted to gain notoriety with reckless assaults, Gibson developed a reputation for methodical execution. He wasn't impulsive. He didn't create unnecessary problems. He followed orders, enforced rules, and avoided drawing the kind of attention that could destabilize the gang's operations. For Brotherhood leaders, inmates with these traits were invaluable, especially as federal pressure intensified in the early 2000s. This rising pressure was no small matter. Federal investigators were beginning to piece together extensive intelligence networks aimed at dismantling prison gangs from the inside. New laws expanded the reach of RICO prosecutions, making it easier to charge entire organizations rather than individual offenders. Prison communications, once thought to be impenetrable to outside authorities, were being intercepted, decoded, and used as evidence. The Brotherhood, long accustomed to operating in the shadows, found itself cornered. Amid this shifting landscape, Gibson's responsibilities grew. Leaders needed men they could trust to carry out sensitive tasks, pass on critical information, and maintain structure while they faced increased isolation. Gibson became one of those men, respected not because he sought attention, but because he avoided it. He stayed off official radars as much as possible, blending into the machinery of the organization, while quietly becoming one of its essential operators. But this trusted role also placed Gibson squarely in the crosshairs when the Brotherhood escalated its internal racial mandate, a directive that would culminate in one of the most damning conspiracies ever uncovered inside the federal prison system. As the gang prepared to target black inmates in a series of racially motivated killings, Gibson was swept into the center of a plot that federal prosecutors would later call a deliberate campaign of murder. For Gibson, the lines between duty and disaster blurred. He was no longer a supporting figure in an underground world. He was now part of a conspiracy that would shock even seasoned investigators, revealing the extreme lengths to which the Aryan Brotherhood would go to enforce its ideology and maintain its power. By the early 2000s, tensions inside the federal prison system were simmering toward a breaking point. The Aryan Brotherhood, under pressure from both rival gangs and federal authorities, began tightening its ranks and doubling down on the ideology that had always defined it: white supremacy enforced through fear. Violence had always been part of the Brotherhood's identity, but now it was becoming a strategic weapon, a tool deployed not simply to resolve immediate threats, but to assert long-term dominance. And as the gang's leadership sought to reaffirm their power, they issued one of the most chilling directives in the organization's modern history: the targeted killing of black inmates. The origins of this murder conspiracy did not come from spontaneous conflict or personal grudges. It grew from a calculated decision by the Brotherhood's leadership, men like Tyler Bingham and Barry Mills, already notorious within the system, to launch what federal prosecutors would later describe as a campaign of racial terror. The motive was simple: power. By targeting black inmates in high-profile killings, the Brotherhood sought to spark a wider racial conflict, one that would reestablish their position as a dominant force inside multiple facilities. The logic was brutal, but consistent with their long-standing strategy: create chaos, then control the aftermath. It was in this environment that Christopher Overton Gibson became directly involved. As a member responsible for managing day-to-day activities, he was part of the communication chain through which orders flowed. Whether passing messages, coordinating logistics, or ensuring that the right individuals understood their roles, Gibson played a part in operationalizing the conspiracy. He was not, according to prosecutors, the mastermind, but he was an enabler, a man positioned close enough to leadership to receive instructions, and dependable enough to help carry them out. Informants and cooperating witnesses later testified that the plan was straightforward in concept, but deadly in execution. The Brotherhood intended to identify specific black inmates, isolate them, and carry out coordinated attacks using makeshift weapons forged from materials inside the prison. These weapons, sharpened pieces of metal, melted plastic formed into stabbing tools, or improvised blades hidden in legal paperwork, were crafted with lethal intent. The objective was to send a message that the Aryan Brotherhood could still control life and death inside the prisons, even under intense federal scrutiny. Federal surveillance had already been increasing at several facilities due to earlier killings linked to the Brotherhood. As a result, investigators began intercepting communications that hinted at a plot. Kites referencing cleanup jobs, coded letters describing pressure building, and intercepted conversations about taking care of business began piling up. Individually, these messages were ambiguous, but together they painted a troubling picture. The Brotherhood was preparing for something significant, and racial rhetoric was at the center of it. Investigators did not yet know the full scope of the plot, but they suspected it involved multiple targets across different facilities. When they began flipping lower-ranking members, men seeking shorter sentences or safety from internal retaliation, the details became clearer. Testimony revealed that Gibson and another Brotherhood figure were involved in conspiring to kill black inmates under direct orders from leadership. This was not a rogue faction acting alone. It was a structured, organized directive. These revelations triggered a massive federal response. The Department of Justice expanded its ongoing investigation into what would become one of the largest RICO indictments in U.S. prison history. More than 40 members and associates of the Brotherhood were ultimately charged, including high-ranking leaders and operational members like Gibson. Prosecutors framed the conspiracy not merely as isolated acts of violence, but as components of a criminal enterprise that used murder to uphold racial doctrine and organizational power. Inside the courtroom, the scale of the conspiracy became clearer and more horrifying. Witnesses, many of them former Brotherhood members who feared retaliation, described the gang's philosophy with chilling clarity. They spoke of orders delivered through coded messages, of meetings held secretly in exercise yards, of weapons smuggled between cells. They detailed how racial hatred was weaponized, how violent acts were framed as business, and how members who refused orders were themselves at risk of death. Through all of this, Gibson's role gained sharper definition. He was neither the architect nor the assassin, but he was a facilitator, an essential link in the chain. Prosecutors argued that his actions, his communications, and his willingness to participate helped enable a conspiracy designed to kill. This was enough to bring the full weight of federal law down upon him. The murder conspiracy, once only whispered inside prison yards, was now fully exposed, and the consequences would be far-reaching, not only for Gibson, but for the entire Aryan Brotherhood leadership structure. What followed was a legal battle that would test the government's ability to dismantle one of America's deadliest prison gangs. By the early 2000s, the Aryan Brotherhood had drawn the full and undivided attention of federal authorities. For years, investigators had pieced together fragments of the gang's operations, intercepted kites, coded letters, informant testimony, and patterns of violence. that rippled through federal penitentiaries across the country. But the organization's conspiracy to target and murder black inmates marked a turning point. It was no longer a question of monitoring the Brotherhood's activities. It was now a race to stop a series of racially motivated killings before the orders could be carried out. Inside command centers across multiple states, federal agents quietly launched an unprecedented investigation that would become one of the largest organized crime prosecutions in the history of the American prison system. What made the Aryan Brotherhood difficult to infiltrate was its decentralization. Leaders issued orders through glimpses of communication, scraps of paper, coded language, and discreet handoffs conducted under the watch of guards and surveillance cameras. Federal investigators understood that dismantling the organization required more than arrests. It required a surgical strike at the highest levels of the Brotherhood's command. That meant gathering irrefutable evidence, testimony from defectors, secretly recorded conversations, intercepted letters that hinted at murder plots, and detailed chronologies of the gang's network across multiple federal facilities. Agents spent years building the case, mapping relationships, creating psychological profiles, and tracking every known associate. As the investigation deepened, Gibson's name surfaced repeatedly. He was not just another soldier, he was intricately connected to the day-to-day operations that kept the conspiracy alive. The government had spoken, the courts had ruled, and the Brotherhood's once feared leadership saw its power fractured. For Gibson, the federal strike marked the beginning of a new chapter, not one of rising influence, but of enduring the consequences of the violent world he had helped uphold. The investigation had exposed everything: the ideology, the hierarchy, and the deadly intent that fueled the conspiracy. And as the dust settled, it became clear that Operation Black Wednesday, one of the most significant federal crackdowns on prison gangs in American history, had changed the trajectory of the Aryan Brotherhood forever. The courtroom where Christopher Overton Gibson faced justice was not an ordinary venue for criminal proceedings. It was a fortified chamber of federal law where marshals stood at every corner, where the air felt heavy with the weight of the crimes being examined, and where the stakes reached far beyond the fate of a single man. This was a trial meant to expose an entire criminal empire operating within America's prison system. The Aryan Brotherhood, long cloaked in secrecy, violence, and coded loyalty, was about to have its inner operations laid bare before a jury that would hear some of the most disturbing testimony ever delivered in a federal courtroom. For Gibson, the trial was not just about whether he personally wielded a weapon or issued a killing order. It was about the role he played within an organization structured around fear, control, and racially motivated violence. From the beginning, prosecutors presented a narrative that stretched across decades. They sought to show the jury that Gibson was not an isolated actor, but part of a disciplined hierarchy that thrived on murder. RICO charges allowed them to do this. Through this lens, even activities that might have seemed small or disconnected on their own became powerful pieces of a broader conspiracy. The prosecution described how Gibson's day-to-day responsibilities supported the Aryan Brotherhood's violent machinery, collecting debts, passing messages, monitoring targets, and ensuring that orders from higher-ranking members were carried out without interruption. Jurors listened as prosecutors explained how these actions contributed to the plot to murder black inmates, a plot prosecutors argued was authorized at the highest levels and executed through trusted soldiers like Christopher Gibson. The testimony was relentless. Former Aryan Brotherhood members, many of them once feared enforcers, took the stand and peeled back layers of secrecy. They spoke of meetings held in cell blocks, of handwritten kites that described targets and weapon placements, of race-driven mandates to clean the yard by eliminating those the Brotherhood deemed enemies. Some witnesses testified under heavy protection, their identities partially shielded, their movements discreetly guarded. Their words painted a grim portrait of life inside federal prisons, where violence was not simply a possibility, but a governing philosophy. One witness described the Brotherhood's approach as organized warfare, a system in which every action had purpose, every killing sent a message, and every member knew the consequences of disobedience. Prosecutors presented intercepted letters and coded messages, explaining how subtle shifts in language signaled violent intent. They traced communication networks that spanned multiple states, linking Gibson to the flow of information that kept the conspiracy alive. The government's case was methodical, almost clinical, but behind each piece of evidence lay the brutal reality of the crimes being discussed. Photos of murder scenes were introduced, grainy prison snapshots of makeshift weapons, blood-stained floors, and hallways where ambush attacks had taken place. The courtroom grew tense as jurors confronted the raw violence that underpinned the Aryan Brotherhood's power. These images were not distant tragedies. They were evidence of the world Gibson helped maintain. Defense attorneys attempted to counter the avalanche of testimony by casting doubt on the credibility of former gang members who had turned informants. They argued that many of these witnesses had motives to lie, sentence reductions, better housing, or personal vendettas.